everybody, and welcome back to Paideia Today. This is season 3 of our podcast, and today we have an absolutely fascinating individual in front of us. We have the towering figure of none other than John Milton. And this is somebody who I have been teaching for years, but I don't delve nearly as deeply into the writings and the thinking of John Milton as does my colleague, Dr. Masson, who has amassed a rather formidable reputation amongst his students for his teaching on Milton. Dr. Masson, can you just take us into a bit of an overview of the man himself? Because he's a fascinating figure biographically. And while this isn't a biography podcast, it's a literary podcast, we still need to know something of the man in order to understand the work that he produced, which is amongst some of the most extraordinary literature in the English canon.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. Milton is somebody that I became acquainted with only when I was an undergrad. He's not somebody who's read in the school system, not even mentioned in the school system. So when I first encountered him in first year English, it was as reading his work, Paradise Lost, which I think most undergrads would not even be exposed to these days, but it was expected in those days because Milton was regarded alongside Shakespeare as one of the two great writers in the English language. And I was overwhelmed simply by the breadth of his learning and the majesty of that particular work. I spent some time. I'm not a Milton specialist, but I'm certainly very interested. He was born in and around the same time as the last writers we dealt with. So he is a contemporary, at least in some measure, with John Donne. Not that he is of the same age, but rather when Donne was the Dean of St. Paul's, Milton went to St. Paul's School. So when he was 12, and possibly went and heard Donne preach. So near enough there. And as we know, Herbert came after him. So there's overlap there in that time period. But we're in a golden age of English literature, I think, for my money. So born in 1608 and dies in 1674. Best known for that work that I mentioned, Paradise Lost. It's the great epic in English literature, to my mind, the greatest poem ever written. But obviously that's a very strong claim and strong statement. Writing during a time for the English-speaking people, an enormously rich period, not just because of the literary influences that we've spoken of already, the English Renaissance and so forth, but the fruits of that period religiously. So the Reformation is now not only there in England, and it's been there for over a century, it's now making its way felt into all aspects of life. So it's not just a theological reformation, it's moving in its way into culture, and it's certainly there in Milton's verse.
Well, he also has a personal connection to the controversies, oftentimes very strident, that come out of this, insofar as his grandfather was Catholic and his father was Protestant, and there was a considerable schism between the grandfather and the father of John Milton.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think his grandfather caught his father reading an English Bible and basically disinherited him, which is an extraordinary thing. Not in the day, it's not extraordinary. For our readership, it's extraordinary that a father and a son could fall out in such an acrimonious fashion for the son reading a book. And what it's really helpful to bring to everyone's attention is how significant and how important religion was to everyone in that day, both the Protestant and the Catholic, right?
That's right. This is not the age of tolerance. The great age of religious tolerance, if that's what we want to call it, comes in the wake of the English Civil War, which we have to talk about here a little bit later today, to throw what Milton's doing and thinking and writing into sharp relief. but I'm not sure we're at that point here yet. But yes, we live in the wake of that Great War, which has many causes, obviously, but one of them, of course, centers on religious controversies and differences. And we need to remember that the way we tend to approach faith as a private sort of an aspect of an individual's character and identity and activity would have been very, very unfamiliar to not to Shakespeare, to Milton and his father and his grandfather. There, when you had differences of religious opinion, it was a cause for debate and sometimes, sadly, conflict. And of course, we see that personally with John Milton himself. And while this was an extraordinary thing, it wasn't, on the other hand, entirely unexpected by people around them. People would imagine that if there were suddenly a father-son schism over Catholicism and Protestantism, that the upshot of that would be extremely serious, and indeed it was.
Yes, it
So,
was. Yeah, I mean, we saw that with Donne as well. He made the same sort of shift, although for him it was the first generation. His father was Catholic, he was brought up Catholic, whereas in Milton's case, his father made the decisive move and then brought up his son out as a Protestant, and still, but it's a decisive split. This is an unbridgeable gulf in the period, and the fruit of that is that there is only one Orthodox religion in England to some degree, and that surrounds the established church, namely the Anglican Church. But that itself is creating problems because the Puritans in the Anglican Church are pushing for further reformation and not simply an accommodation or an attempt that Elizabeth herself tried to, I think, advance of a broader church that would hold different factions under the same umbrella. The Puritans are not having that, particularly since the monarch of the day, Charles I, is, to say leaning towards Catholicism is probably an understatement. He is doing things that they find absolutely offensive. And again, the illustration of Milton's father and grandfather illustrates how heartfelt their sentiments are. They can't tolerate their monarch, who allegedly is Anglican and therefore Protestant, acting like a Catholic, and that eventually leads to the English Civil War. Certainly one of the significant causes.
and Milton himself is by nature particularly well equipped to swim in these waters of controversy and debate and people taking very clear stands on issues, religious, political, and otherwise, because he is very formidable when it comes to debate. B, he seems to be very inclined to debate. He likes argument and disputation and things like this, and builds an extraordinary reputation for being very good at this.
Mm.
And finally, he is almost ridiculously erudite. I think he's probably one of the most learned authors you and I have looked at in all our podcasts. He is simply off the charts.
I think that's fair to say. I don't know there's any debate, never has been a debate over that. Nobody disputes Milton's erudition. They might not like his politics, they might not disagree with his religious beliefs, but they don't doubt the giftedness of the individual or the degree with which he sought to fan into flame those gifts. So in terms of his education, his early education, as I say, he went to school at St. Paul's at the age of 12, so roughly in the high school. So the stage of rhetoric in terms of his education, and from there went to Cambridge, spent 1 year there, and then he was thrown out. He was rusticated for falling out with his tutor, and which is in itself interesting, I think. And then came back a year later, but he spent 7 years at Cambridge studying, first a bachelor's degree and then a master's degree. And in spite of that, does not speak well of his contemporaries at Cambridge. He did not feel he was appreciated, that he didn't find any or many people that were of the same, I don't know, they weren't, I'm not going to say intellectual peers of his. It's more that they lack sympathy for his breadth of interests and so forth.
He had a pejorative nickname at Cambridge, did he not? The White Lady of...
It was the lady of gosh, what do they call him? The lady of
Christchurch? Or...
Christchurch, yeah.
Yeah.
Because he had long
Yeah.
hair in the fashion of the day, and his features were relatively fine, so he looked rather effeminate, I guess. So it was meant pejoratively, but I don't think that in any way that he was effeminate. I think very much a manly man, but certainly in his appearance. And the
Yeah.
hairstyle was just the fashion of the day.
Exactly.
Um,
but then he's not content with this.
No, then I think he leaves there, and he had intentions to go into the ministry, but he didn't go into the ministry for some reason, and it's not clear to I don't think there's any consensus on why that actually is the case, and I don't think Milton mentions the reason why he didn't do that. But he wasn't happy at Cambridge, maybe because of the scholastic. So as I say, he spent 7 years at Cambridge, but he was not satisfied with his studies there, and he went on to a 6-year period of private study. And in that 6 years, he studied, I think, the classical authors in both Greek and Latin, and read them in the original. And it becomes clear subsequently, after the fact, based on his writing, that the reason for this is to prepare himself for his grand vocation in life, which is to be the great English poet. He regarded his gifts to be worthy of such a high office as he saw it, and he needed the preparation to do that. So he spent 13 years of study at the university and post-university level in order to prepare himself for that great labor of his life. And then, interestingly, spent most of his life not doing that very thing for which he felt he was called to do. So that in itself is interesting.
Yeah, it's we have to remember here that whatever else you want to say about Milton, he is not either artificially or naturally a humble man. He knows that he is extremely intelligent, and he has no problem in telling people he's extremely intelligent, which would be impossibly off-putting if not for the fact that he could demonstrate on the spot at any point that he was the smartest man in the room.
Yeah.
So that qualifies our understanding of his claims as to who he was intellectually and artistically to some extent.
Yeah. No, I think that's correct. He certainly didn't lack a sense of his own prowess. At the age of 30, after this extended period of study, so 13 years, he goes abroad. He goes to Italy, and there he presents himself and is received as the great poet of England because he's written a few poems by this point. Although this is interesting as well, the first published poet that he wrote was a poem to Shakespeare, or on Shakespeare rather, and it was in the second edition of Shakespeare's complete works. So there's a 16-line poem which he publishes and basically states that Shakespeare doesn't need a monument because his verse is the monument to the man, and the verse represents the man, which is a theme he very much picks up on in his later work Areopagitica, how a writing is more of a representation of a man than the man himself. It's better to kill a man than to kill a book, right? Because the one is the distillation of the other. The actual essence of the man is the written word, which is a thoroughly theological understanding of writing, and you would not find this in the ancient world either. So this is a really interesting reflection.
We probably should also mention, before we lose sight of it here, that 13 years of higher education, obviously at an extremely formidable level, is extraordinary in Milton's day. Nowadays, we talk in the academy occasionally of career students, the student who's always going to take another MA or PhD in something, and they spend, some of them can spend decades in the university. whereas this was not at all the case in Milton's time.
No.
The 13 years is off the charts, and clearly, looking at the product, it was time well spent on a mind like Milton's. In addition to this, you've mentioned the languages, and we should mention a little bit more about that. Milton is also an extraordinarily formidable language person. I was going to call him a linguist, but that's not correct. He's got Greek, and his Greek is extremely good. He's got Latin, which is potentially even better. He also has Italian, though, and he's complimented on this when he goes on his tour to Italy.
They regarded him as fluent in Italian to be able to speak and write as well as in Italian in that language. And I'm not quite sure why Italian, other than the Renaissance itself, and probably his attraction to the humanists. And the humanists probably shared his contempt for Aristotle and scholastic philosophy. You can see that, and scholasticism was part of the intellectual milieu of Cambridge, so that might again be one of the reasons he didn't feel at home in Cambridge. I don't know. But when he went to Italy, the site of the original sort of Renaissance, he met friends there and he rubbed shoulders. He was there for 16 months with people in Rome and also in Florence. So in those two places, obviously the ecclesiastical center of the Catholic speaking world and the cultural center of Italian humanism. And he spent 16 months there with these individuals, which becomes very important later in life when he becomes the chief spokesman for Oliver Cromwell's government, Republican government that has just executed the king, and he's writing letters back and forth in Latin with people that he probably knows or is acquainted with, because again he's trying to keep the Catholic princes and leaders from invading England and crushing this Republican government. And he's writing to them probably from firsthand acquaintance, but certainly from reputation. And it's largely Milton's own reputation that keeps them at bay. And that's interesting.
Yeah, he builds up strong connections there. There's obviously not just intellectual respect for Milton. There also seems to be expressed by certain individuals a personal respect. And taking into account the fact that Milton is not just Protestant, but very specifically that he's a Puritan, and a Puritan who believes very strongly in certain theological positions and is willing to debate them, argue them, engage, as it were, in sparring with individuals who might differ with him in a very energetic sense. A lot of people are surprised by the fact that nevertheless he is friends with Catholics, that he can debate them and yet have an extremely civil, personal relationship with these individuals. And in this sense, Milton is a bit of a model when it comes to debate and dialectic and all these sorts of things, in that he has a very civilized approach to this as well. He can disagree extremely strongly with somebody and mount a very, very formidable argument about why their position is wrong and why his position is right. And nevertheless, he is very liked by these same people in Italy, the Catholics, with whom he establishes this vast network, which turns out to be, as you mentioned, enormously to the benefit of England.
Right. And when you say that he was at odds with them, he refers to Catholics and the popes in Paradise Lost as the Antichrist, right? So these are he's not pulling punches here. This is extremely strong stuff. This is the stuff that led his grandfather to fall out with his father. This is the degree of the sentiment there. It's that strong. But he, as I say, he's there in Italy for 16 months, and he meets, among others, Galileo under virtual house arrest there, and he is the only contemporary of Milton's that is mentioned in Paradise Lost. Very odd, very interesting. And I'm wondering if one of the reasons for that is that Milton himself, when he writes Paradise Lost, is himself under virtual house arrest by Catholic figures. Again, so there might be a little bit of a parallelism being drawn there between two figures that the Catholic Church is effectively hindering and persecuting and limiting. And obviously Galileo is by this time a famous figure for the intellect and for scientific progress and so forth. So that in itself is very interesting.
You have to assume with somebody as sharp as Milton that he's going to see the associations between Galileo's circumstances and the motives behind that on the one hand, and his own circumstances later in life at the end of his career when he himself is on the receiving end of state-sanctioned scrutiny, shall we call it. We're trying to be polite about it, but it was relatively rough. Indeed, his greatest work, Paradise Lost, was often written under conditions of considerable duress. He suffered from gout. It would eventually kill him. He was entirely blind by 1652. So some of the greatest poetry ever written in English was not written by the author himself with pen on paper. It was written by dictation, which is extraordinary in its own way, and we'll come back to that later on in subsequent podcasts. Nevertheless, Milton was himself. He had a very interesting career, which had its ups and downs, predictably. We also need to briefly take into account, I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, his domestic circumstances. And I mention these first and foremost because the domestic relationships between the characters of Adam and Eve in Paradise Lost are of central concern. One of several central concerns. And we discover that in spite of his very strong, very, in some senses, orthodox, not all of them, but in some senses, orthodox position on Christianity and the tenets of Christianity, that nevertheless he went through 3 marriages. Do you want to say a little bit about that? In fact, he went so far as to write a treatise on divorce in the wake of events around his first wife. Over to you, Dr. Mazen.
Great. Over to me. Well, yes, that's correct. All of this is correct. And it's certainly a popular view in our day to present, and this is probably not uncommon in our day, but it's a popular view to present Milton as a misogynist in the way that he, chiefly the way he treated his daughters. And you mentioned the dictation. His daughters were the ones who he was reading, or rather reciting the lines that he wanted them to dictate, and then they did so. But also for the portrait of the relations of Adam and Eve prior to the fall as effectively hierarchical almost in certain ways. In this, just reflecting biblical teaching on the subject, but in a way that's not, there's no qualification and so forth, which one would expect. And so this portrait of Milton as a misogynist, which I think his treatise on the doctrine of divorce seems to undercut that to some degree. So does his portrait of in Comus of the lady that is being besieged there, and he even casts a woman in the part of the virtuous figure, which is extraordinary in his day. It would not have been represented as a woman standing for virtue. So I think there are many things that speak against the portrait of Milton as a misogynist. In many ways, you can see Milton very much as a free thinker on the relation of the two sexes. And so that's the first thing. And the second thing is, yes, he does write a treatise on divorce, which to my mind, for a thinker who's supposedly orthodox, is an extraordinary thing, and somewhat embarrassing perhaps for those who would defend his orthodoxy, because he deserts his wife, Mary Powell, only a few months after marrying her. And we're not even quite sure why that is, although Mary was a royalist and Milton very much not so. And could be age difference as well. He's 34, she's 17. That hasn't impeded other marriages over the years, but it's a significant age difference. But I think there are various things there that, and Milton was probably planning on marrying another woman, but he didn't exactly. And they had 3 daughters, and the 3 daughters are actually the ones that he cites, he reads his poem to then in the end. And then his wife dies, so he doesn't divorce her. He argues for divorce, but he doesn't divorce her. He is given this these three daughters, as I say. So these are interesting. But one final comment. His wife is the royalist. He is the Republican. They have a clear disagreement there, and she won't bend to his will on this. It's interesting that they stay married despite his strong feelings on it. And secondly, it's also interesting that his brother is a royalist, and his brother was probably one of the figures that kept him from being executed when Charles II returned, because the house arrest was the I would say the relatively moderate treatment. Most of the Republicans would have been executed when Charles returned, but Milton was not, and it might have been because his brother interceded on his behalf. There are others who did so as well, like Andrew Marvell. But anyway,
Right. He also was reportedly extremely distraught by the death of his second wife. Clearly, they
yes,
had a very, very deep, very real relationship, and it was said to have rather shattered him, along with the death of his infant daughter around the same time. So we all have to take that into account when we're discussing Milton. There's another thing here I want to come back to, in a sense, which is this notion of Milton being an intellectual rather than a philologist. And this is more my take than anything else, so take it with a grain of salt. But it is this, that Milton is willing to entertain all sorts of claims and proposals. Some of them really quite radical, and some of these are theological, some of these are philosophical, some of these are political. But he's willing to engage in speculation and debate about certain things like this. So his position, for instance, on idolatry later on is something which causes considerable controversy amongst his peers. Nevertheless, is something he's willing to delve into and think about. But the reason why this speculative aspect of Milton's thinking, I think, is sometimes obscured is because his mind is so extraordinarily formidable that it looks like he might be stating absolute dogmatic facts, when in point of fact, he may not be. And this is going to be camouflaged by the fact that the way he engages it is particularly formidable. Likewise with his treatise on divorce. Is he speculating here? Remember, John Donne, of course, at a certain point in his career, wrote a treatise on the legitimacy of suicide. An extraordinary document, really, considering not just the age, but the seemingly clear, strong orthodoxy of John Donne's faith. Likewise with John Milton. The man seems to be extremely concerned about the legitimacy of his faith, and he is continuously working at it, speculating upon it, polishing it, scrutinizing it, critiquing it, in various ways in order to build that up. So when something highly speculative does come up, if indeed the treatise on divorce is speculative, it can take us very much by surprise. But less so if you remember that this is also an age of considerable speculation. So it's an age where people take deeply entrenched positions on important issues. They debate vigorously, and with the rise of the English Civil War, violently. But nevertheless, it is still a speculative age, and these people are not being mindlessly dogmatic. And our own age, I think, as readers of Milton, can obscure that, because we do live in an extremely dogmatic age of extreme opinions clashing and what have you. But this is not free intellectual speculation. Our day is much more dogmatic in that sense, much more philological, if you like, than Milton's day. And I think it's important for us to keep that in view when we're reading and thinking about Milton.
well, I think it's very much the case that his age is far more willing to entertain ex, uh, strong positions articulated in public. And of course, there'll be strong consequences for that, but they tend to nonetheless to express them and be willing to bear the consequences for them. Whereas our day seems to me to be marked more by intellectual cowardice and a lack of conviction about the very views that are being presented. And amongst those that will defend free speech, even, there's a lack of courage and conviction about those very things, which is the reason why radicals shout them down and have effectively killed free speech in many institutions. It's really interesting that his most famous work defending free speech, was the first in the English language, and in fact in any language. Is called Areopagitica,
Yes, exactly.
which Ares is Mars and the Pagos is the hill. So it's a Mars Hill address. It's the place in Athens where the High Court of Athens would meet. It's also where St. Paul debated the philosophers of the day in Acts 17. So Milton is drawing upon all of those things, but he's defending the liberty of expression and the non censorship. He's writing against censorship. The context for that is that he is writing against a parliament, and at this point it is a parliament of. So he argues not only that the government should not license publications or engage in censorship, he does so in the backdrop of a bill that has been passed by Cromwell's government doing exactly that. So it's already passed the bill saying that it's going to censor and license publication, and he writes against that position that Parliament has just adapted. So he's writing in favor of free speech after free speech has already been restricted. And of course, at this point, he's obviously courting controversy by doing precisely that, because the law has already been passed. Now, it's been passed by those who purportedly are opposed to the Catholic process of a codex or index of books and so forth, and a censorious process, which is characteristic of the Inquisition. And Milton draws their attention to that fact, that you are engaging in exactly the processes that you said were characteristic of tyrannical institutions, and you are doing exactly the same thing. And so he says that these invariably come out of repressive governments, and you want to avoid that. You want to promote knowledge, you want to test experience, you want to strive for truth, because for Milton, truth will always vanquish its opponent as long as the field of battle is open. And this work of his ends up being one of the preeminent defenses of free speech in the English language. And to my mind, it is in fact the best. Now, the title, by the way, is also that of the famous Greek orator Socrates. And obviously he's which was addressed to the Athenian council. So he is, again, he's writing as a Christian in the context of Christianity, but he is clearly invoking classical precedent, and we're writing to a republican government, again, drawing to their attention Isocrates writing to the Athenian council in a republican government. Let's behave like a republic should do, and a Christian republic at that. So he's making a strong appeal on multiple fronts, and it's a very terrific and a persuasive work. Of course, it did nothing to persuade them to drop the censorship.
No, its influences on posterity thereafter.
Yeah.
To a huge extent. And it's also a lot of people adopting modern perspectives on this period in history, and Milton in particular, are again surprised here. Milton is somebody who argues, albeit perhaps speculatively, in favor of divorce. He's somebody who is arguing in defense of free speech. And nevertheless, he's typified, as you've said, in modern times as a very puritanical Puritan. And I use puritanical in sort of the common popular sense rather than its strict sense. And that as such, he's a bit of a totalitarian. He's a bit dogmatic. He's a bit of a killjoy. And if anybody was going to argue against free speech, surely it would be Milton, or so the students in the modern university would think from the portrayal of Milton by their teachers and professors. Whereas if you actually study the literary evidence, precisely the opposite obtains. And
Exactly.
oftentimes my students, when I introduce them to these aspects, they're really quite shocked. They had a picture of Milton in their mind, if I'm lucky when that student comes in, and it is a picture which is oftentimes diametrically opposed to the actual man himself as he puts himself into his text. And that brings me to another point I'd like to mention briefly. You talked about how the book is more essential to the man than the man himself. It is, as it were, his essence distilled down to the vital aspects.
I'll give you a quote on that in a minute, but go on.
Yes. And so, of course, this is another facet of his defense of free speech, because the free speech in particular here that he's defending, amongst other things, is that of books, the speech of books, not just political speeches from the soapbox and stuff like this. And so if you censor that effectively, you kill the men themselves. You may as well be involved in something of a reign of terror, albeit in literary form. But give us that quotation. I'd be happy to hear it.
Yeah, for books, he writes, are not absolutely dead things, but do contain a potency of life in them to be as active as that soul was whose progeny they are. Who kills a man kills a reasonable creature, God's image. But he who destroys a good book kills reason itself, kills the image of God, as it were, in the eye. Now, note that it's a good book that he says this. When Milton is defending free speech, he's not defending free speech in the sense that there's something sacrosanct about absolute freedom in the libertarian sense of our contemporaries. It's in particular conjunction with the use of language, and in particular in its conjunction with the word, and not just with images. And again, you mentioned his work on idolatry, Iconoclastes. He writes against graven images and so forth. And in doing that, he falls into a line of Protestant thinking very strong on this very point, emphasizing the second of the Pentateuch, the Decalogue, the second injunction, the Decalogue, thou shalt not make a graven image and so forth. So he's very much strongly against the use of images. On the other hand, the use of words, the opposite. And that's for theological reasons that he expresses the importance of that. But he does say that it's possible to censor things after they've been published, because once they've been published, then they can be debated, disputed, and the errors therein can be demonstrated. And if there are errors and there are infamies in it, then obviously they ought not to be read in the same way, and depending on the degree thereof. I mean, he doesn't get into all that, but he doesn't dispute that censorship is possible, just simply it ought not to happen before the fact. We can always say this ought not to be read after the fact, but let's not stop or go through an approval process before the fact, because the people that will be then judging upon this are lesser individuals. They're bureaucrats, and they're not fit to be in the editor's position of censoring people who are their instructors and their superiors, like Milton, for instance, obviously.
Yeah, this is a point which is perhaps particularly relevant to our modern listeners, because again, we live in an age where free speech is, quote unquote, being looked at hard again. And we see this, many of the points that he's making in Areopagitica are strikingly relevant to what we have here today. And the point you just made here, and the point that, of course, Milton was making, was that one of the reasons not to muzzle free speech is that you don't know what kind of pernicious thinking and art is out there until it's out there. And so it needs to go out there to move into the public forum of debate, where we can actually scrutinize these things. But of course, if you think that we live in an age after reason, then there's no way of actually getting at a good book or a bad book and determining which is which, because we live in an age of philosophical relativism.
Yes.
So deciding that question, what is good and what is not good, is impossible.
Yeah.
So this is the age of, this is another qualifier of modern censorship as we encounter it. This, on the other hand, is a very different aspect of Milton's age, where debate still was assumed to be capable of delving down into truth or into falsehood.
Yeah, no, and he note that language. He talks about man being a reasonable creature, God's image. So he talks about the imago Dei, and he talks about the capacity for reasoning being a defining human feature. In our day, people will say that statement, that man is a reasonable creature or has rationality, is misogynist, racist, who knows what. But it's certainly, they will reject that definition. Now, on what basis they reject it is unclear. Is that because they don't make an argument for it, they simply say it's not true. Well, they demonstrate their own incapacity to reason at that point, and perhaps they ought not to be taken seriously in their opinions at that point. But in general, academia and the whole of the Western world, the inheritance of Christendom, has always regarded reasoning as the one of the key features of human nature. And when I say that, I'm not only talking about the Christian period, but that of the classical civilization out of which it came as well. They would have regarded the same thing. Reasoning is one of the distinctive features of human nature.
Yeah. Well, we see the association now, several decades old, between logocentrism and the dominance of reason as one of the key, if not the key lens through which one views the world and the self. We see that association of logocentrism with phallocentrism.
Yep.
And both of these things have arbitrarily pejorative connotations that they drag into the room with them when these words are used in discussions. And these are things which ought to be deconstructed and overturned. And of course, as soon as you or I would ask them, okay, why is that? What is your reason? Is that true? They would immediately say, look, you're doing it again. Truth, that's phallocentric and logocentric. Reasoning is logocentric and phallocentric. We reject these claims. So I can't even ask you if that claim is true, because truth doesn't exist, at least as traditionally conceived. But again, one of the points here that we need to keep at the forefront of our listeners' minds is that this is not the case in Milton's day. They did believe that they could get at truth. And one of the upshots of this, of course, is what's the elephant in the room that you and I haven't really mentioned yet, which is the absolutely cataclysmic English Civil War. And this colors absolutely everything around this intellectual and artistic discussion. Because one of the things, well, first of all, most of my first year students don't know anything about the English Civil War. They don't oftentimes even know that it happened. And this is, to me, extraordinary, because it is, by just about everybody's account, the most catastrophic war England has ever endured. And the aftershocks of the trauma of that war, as with all great wars, but especially civil wars, are something that fundamentally changed English consciousness, English culture, English art, and English literature. If you
Yep.
don't understand the aftershocks of the English Civil War, you will not understand enormous realms of why the English do what they do and think as they think and write as they write. More people died per capita in the English Civil War than in any other war, and I'm including World Wars I and II. They don't match. Moreover, the nature of the violence and the trauma was of a different sort than England had really seen before. Women and children were very much in the front line at times. And it was a war that was also bound up not only with religion, but of course politics and the very way in which England would articulate itself and proceed. And so it affected every level of English society. Milton is in the thick of this. Can you give us your impression of Milton's response to the English Civil War specifically?
Well, it's a very complex phenomenon, as you know, and there are many different sides that become allies in the same cause. Even if you're on the royalist side, you're not necessarily only supporting the monarch Charles I for his religion. You might be supporting him simply because he's the monarch, and you are going to appeal to Romans 13 on obeying those in authority and so forth. And it's the right.
Mm-hmm.
And those sorts of arguments will be made, irrespective of the fact that they may agree that the man himself is contemptible and his actions are deplorable, but they still don't think that he ought to be deposed, and they will appeal to the divine right of kings and so forth. On the other side, you will get people that will oppose Charles for a wide variety of reasons, from religious, as in they regard him as a papist and an antichrist figure, to the fact that he suppressed parliament and that he suppressed the people, even though the people have developed institutions that reflect the fact that they too are made in the image of God and that they share a part in the political order. And so Milton himself engages this in a treatise called The Tenure of Kings and Magistrates, and it's probably during the trial of Charles I, although it was only published after his death, which says that they ought to abolish tyrannical kingship and they ought to execute tyrants. Now that's interesting there. The main reasoning for this is, and this is my view of Milton rather than the whole period, Milton is the defender of the conscience. He believes that conscience is something that is sacrosanct. Rather than the political order, it is the order within the individual, the allegiance to God, which ought to be preserved insofar as it can be, and even through violence at that point. And the problem with Charles is that he was imposing a certain type of political theology on his contemporaries, saying you must worship according to the Book of Common Prayer, and you must. This is how you are to worship. And for him, that was the final straw. You have no authority to do so. There ought to be some sort of separation of powers there, and there ought to be freedom. Oliver Cromwell allowed this within his ranks, and in fact he fell out with the Scots over this. The Scots thought, okay, we've got rid of Charles I, this is great, now we're going to bring in Presbyterian government. And Cromwell says, oh no, we're not. You're allowed to be that way, and I'm not going to impose this on you, but you must not impose Presbyterianism on the rest of the country. The Scots didn't agree, and so Cromwell went up and invaded Scotland over it as well. But it was this idea of freedom of conscience there that it seems to me is the spirit of the age as much as anything else. And certainly it's characteristic of Milton's writing. I don't want to speak of the whole range of motivations in the period, because there really is a broad range, from the levelers on the extreme wing who think that every person ought to have franchise, ought to have the vote. It's the beginning of the democratic movement, to the other end, where it really is the aristocrats who ought to have a greater say in governance, rather than the entirety of the army and so forth. But so there's a great deal of diversity, and to be fair to Cromwell, he allows them to have this debate. It's called the Putney Debates. You can read about it to this day. There's a diversity, but Milton himself, I think, defends conscience. That's his main interest and appeal.
Yeah, again, to come back from a different angle to what was said before here, a lot of people have this two-dimensional understanding of Milton as this rather tyrannical figure trying to impose his will on everything. And one can easily get that impression because he's so quick and so formidable when it comes to debate. But again, this is another point here that I think you're at least implicitly making, which is that in his defense of the individual conscience, Milton is foregrounding the centrality of the individual over the institution, over the whole, as it were. So again, we have something of a nominalist rather than a universalist perspective on these things. I should also mention, you mentioned the Putney Debates, and that's absolutely brilliant. But if you don't know anything about the English Civil War, there are a number of great documentaries out there that you can watch or read or anything like this. And one of the most influential individuals when it comes to discussions about the English Civil War and its causes is our good colleague, Dr. Ian Gentles, who is an enormously erudite individual on these fronts, as well as being an absolutely wonderful human being. So check out his works as well. Do we want to talk about, well, you've mentioned quite a number of his works which are less read. You've mentioned Comus, you've mentioned Lycidas, you've mentioned Areopagitica, which is absolutely wonderful. Before we get to Paradise Lost itself, are there any other texts that we need to push to the fore for our listeners as important Miltonic readings?
Well, I actually think that most of his work is important. I said I thought he was the greatest English poet, and I put him above Shakespeare. And one of the reasons is because I think he's a master of form. And he does not write only epics. He writes drama. He writes pastoral elegy. He writes again, the drama of Comus, that particular type of masque, so a courtly document of the day. On the morning of Christ's nativity, he's writing a hymn of sorts, all of which, and then he writes translations of biblical Psalms. He writes sonnets, famous in their own right. He writes basically every literary form, and to my mind does so in a masterful fashion. And so I think, and I'll be teaching Milton next semester, and trying to cover some of the material there. He also writes a tragedy. His very last literary endeavor is writing a meditation or reflection, which is effectively a tragedy on Samson. It's called Samson Agonisties. He does write Paradise Lost, his most famous work, but he also writes the part two of that, as it were, which is Paradise Regained. Here's how it was lost. Here's how Paradise was regained. All of them are worthy of reading and study, I think. And it's unfortunate when you go to a syllabus of even a university that tries to be faithful to a traditional approach, that you end up reading one work from every author because you don't want to spend too much time on just one to the exclusion of others. And I do that to my own undergraduates as well. We only deal with Paradise Lost in first year English. But I think we do Milton a disservice by just placing him alongside lesser poets simply to have a breadth of engagement, because really all of his works are worthy of study. Anyway, but I have strong views on that, obviously.
Yeah, Milton is one of these authors with whom I make my point, at least to my first year students, that his sheer level and complexity of learning and the sheer numbers of allusions in a passage of Milton's writing to philosophers, to writers, to historical political figures, and so on and so forth. It's dizzying. It can be absolutely dizzying. And I would say when it comes to sheer erudition, this is one of the things that only a few writers in Western history can match. So we've got Dante, of course, who is also enormously learned, and he could not have written his Divine Comedy without that erudition undergirding or forming the foundation of his masterful work. We see a similar sort of erudition, albeit articulated in a very different way, in Virgil's Aeneid. We see it again articulated in the works of Homer, and particularly in the Iliad. In fact, to my mind, the only other English writer who is as potentially erudite, at least as demonstrated in his work, is an individual who sadly we haven't looked at all, Edmund Spenser, and his Fairy Queen in particular, which is fascinating. Well, what helped me with understanding and appreciating the erudition of Edmund Spenser was the Penguin edition's enormously replete footnotes. By the way, Edmund Spenser's Fairy Queen was C.S. Lewis's favorite literary work. And with that in mind, do you have an edition of Paradise Lost you feel comfortable recommending?
Mm-hmm. That is a good, gosh, it caught me off guard there.
Sorry.
I tend to use one that I was introduced to as an undergraduate because I like the footnotes. I think they're very helpful and explanatory without going into detail, which I think detracts from the enjoyment and appreciation and understanding of the work, that of John Shawcross, and that's from 1971. That's the one I use. There are obviously others that are out there, and I haven't read them all, so maybe there are superior ones, but I find most contemporary editions of works tend to want to reflect not only on the scholarship related to Milton, but more on the literary theories and angles of approach to the scholarship. And they're more, this is critics talking about critics.
Yeah.
And I find that unhelpful to the normal reader, and often it ends up being rather a self-justifying process. And then the volumes they get bigger and bigger, but they're filled not with the primary subject, but with the critics themselves. And I just don't think most of them are worth reading.
That's right. More Hellenistic dross, as it were, more eisegesis and less exegesis.
Yeah, that's so. Some of the older editions are simply superior. Shawcross is very good. The footnotes are helpful. I do think that there's been things that have been added to that, but for the economy of the scholarship, yes.
Yeah, another individual, another scholar we should mention in regards to Milton is Dennis Danielson,
Oh, yes.
who
Now, I don't know if he's brought out an edition, but I think Danielson is very good indeed.
as a commentator, yes, he's again, he's enormously learned. He is insightful. He has a powerful critical mind. And I find that whenever I read his work on Milton, I find myself very much illuminated, and the material that I'm reading seems to me very solid. It's well argued, it's well backed up, it's very concrete in a lot of ways that other commentary on Milton is not. But we're not going to get too bogged down with the critics here. We want to keep Milton front stage center.
Yeah.
Now, this great work, Paradise Lost, the last, I think most people would agree, the last great epic written in English, and some would say in the West, but certainly in English, didn't necessarily start with its original orientation, an epic about man's first disobedience to God or what have you. Milton was playing around with writing this text for a long time, even when he was a young man. But of course, as you and I have said numerous times in this podcast, epic is the greatest and noblest of all genres, and only the greatest writers can ever pull it off successfully. So while Milton, as a young man, was playing with this idea of writing his magnum opus, Paradise Lost, it started off as something which was going to initially be oriented on another figure who you and I have talked about a few times in this series already, and that is King Arthur.
Hmm.
Yeah. Did you want to say a little bit more about that and the gestation of Milton's Paradise Lost?
It's part of the legend around Milton himself is this strong sense, which he expresses quite openly in his own works, about a vocation to write the great English epic, which was early in conception but late in production.
Yes.
And I would have thought by the time he reaches this stage in his life, he might have wondered whether he would ever get to write this epic, but such was his devotion to public service and the public good that he did not retreat from defending the Cromwell's republic, but was in the forefront of doing so. The very thing that is to some degree the subject matter of Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained and Samson Agonistes and Areopagitica and his little treatise of education, all of these things that are formative in some ways of Milton's own mind are expressed in his later poems. But then it did come about, and it came about, as you say, when he was blind. He's blinded by this stage. Now, you would have thought, with such a strong sense of vocation and such a sense of his own importance in God's economy, what would God do without me? You never hear Milton say that, but there is a strong sense of that he is been called out to do a special service, that he might have grown discouraged over the years, but he as I say, he is brought to this position, and then he can't read. He can't read, and therefore he can't write. And in this, he sees in Paradise Lost precedents for this, and the precedents go far back to the most famous of all, Homer himself, who was believed to be blind.
Yes.
There's an extraordinary thing, because what it demonstrates is his huge developed capacity for memory. And memory, remember the mother of the muses is Mnemosyne, who's memory. And Milton's memory of what he's read must have been so deep and rich that he could just simply draw upon this. And then he says at the beginning of Paradise Lost that while he is sleeping at night, the muse dictates to him what he is to say the next day, and then he says it, and his daughters write it down.
Yeah, we need to remember here that according to classical models of education, memorizing played a very central place in that endeavor. And so we encounter some of these powerful intellectual figures. I think back most notably to Augustine. Augustine, we can demonstrate, is reproducing large passages of texts, and he's reproducing the ideas very accurately, but we can tell from the places where there are glitches in the quoted script that this is not being copied across from one document to another document. This is Augustine remembering what was said in that passage. And sometimes it's, it's a paragraph long and stuff like
Yeah.
this.
And he's got
And
one or two words wrong, and therefore they say it's a copying mistake. Well, actually, it's not.
no, in fact, oftentimes you can demonstrate that it's a phonetic and mistake and therefore not a scribal error of
Yeah.
some kind. And likewise with Milton, Milton obviously has a huge amount of information in his head. And if you think about classical approaches to memorizing things, whether they're texts or other details, historical details, mathematical paradigms, doesn't really matter what it is. Having this information in your brain rather than in a text at your side is absolutely vital, because then the engagement of what is in your mind and what you're reading is instantaneous, and its output, its result in terms of aesthetic effect and in terms of intellectual effect is exponentially vastly greater than if you'd had to consult your notes on something here or consult the text here or there. It's all in your brain right there, right now, as you read. There's an entire constellation of
I think this is the most important point that's been made in the whole podcast, uh, which is that repository of knowledge, which is there not at your fingertips, but rather within your memory. You can draw and make the connections, the allusions, and so forth are being drawn upon from the depths of your entire being in some way, in the way that they've not only been memorized, but then connected and reformed and reforged. Those produce a standard of writing and scholarship, which there is no way of reproducing that. So in our generation, we would read the books, but did we memorize them? And the answer is usually no. And in the contemporary academic environment, when my students say that they're going to look something up, they do a Google search. Well, the Google search is, first of all, usually superficial, and there's no evaluation of what constitutes a good take on something or a poor or a misrepresentation of it, first of all. But secondly, they don't actually know anything. They're simply consulting an authority, but the authority is not particularly authoritative, usually, to my mind. But what they certainly don't know is they don't know anything. And they're not, because they're not remembering anything. So they have no way of evaluating whether something has any legitimacy in terms of the weight of tradition, whether it's been repudiated or substantiated by weighty individuals who've mulled these things over for a long time and gestated it and passed it on. The most recent ridiculous opinion is set alongside the longest standing, most rich, wise statement on any subject, and the contemporary student has no way of evaluating which is superior. They can
no.
say, this one's older, this is the new way of putting it. I'll go with the new one.
We no longer gauge the material we learn, the information we take in, on the basis of authority as it arises from auctoritas. Instead, what is given to us via the internet search or something like this is it's selected on the basis of its merely fashionable popularity.
Yep.
The site with the most clicks is the one that you're going to get first. And that
Yep.
is an appalling standard by which to assess the information that you're getting. And moreover, it's this information, when they get the information, because they do Google everything nowadays, and that's just the way of the world. But the problem is, when you get information like that, it goes into your short-term memory back here, and it lingers there for a little bit. You scribble down a note or you make a comment to your friend based on that information, and it dribbles on out of your short-term memory, because short-term memory, it's, as the name suggests, is not going to retain anything for long-term usage. You have to concentrate hard and exclusively on that detail, that paradigm, that date, that name, what have you, for at least 8 seconds before your brain decides, aha, this might be important information, and fires it into your long-term memory cortex. But the internet search produces no lasting record. There are ripples on the surface of the water, and soon the water is flat and calm again, and it's gone. And moreover, having this knowledge, the important knowledge, that is to say, not just ephemera, such as is oftentimes looked up on Google, it brings this knowledge in your mind into a different mode of engagement, which you and I have just discussed here to some extent. Is what Albertus Magnus would have called experiential knowledge. as you're experiencing the reading of a text, you are knowing experientially its associations, allusions, connections to the wide, scintillating matrix of knowledge which has gone before, that surrounds the text. And something like Paradise Lost is designed to be read that way. So it's experiential knowledge, not merely rational knowledge, which is looked up at your fingertips, as you say.
And the last great articulator of this is probably T.S. Eliot, an individual tradition and the individual talent. Whatever I make of his own writing and his comparisons, though, he has an understanding of that richness and the importance of that richness.
Yeah, you have that famous quotation, a mixing of memory and desire. The memory is your memory, which informs your desires for your future. And if those two are not living in a proper harmonic union, then you live in the wasteland. It's all for nothing. It's all sterile.
Yeah,
Um, and nowadays we live in an age of people who are, through no fault of their own, largely amnesiacs. They know nothing.
that's the exact phrase that I use. And an amnesiac is somebody who's lost his memory, as you know.
Hmm.
And a person who's lost his memory cannot be trusted by anybody around them
No.
because he's unpredictable. There's no pattern for that person to behave. If you think about it, if you've lost your memory, you don't know who the people are around you. You don't know how, you don't have a pattern of relationship that you can draw upon. Everyone who comes to you is on the same equal footing, so that your wife could be treated as if she were a stranger. In fact, that's how you will treat her. And likewise, somebody that you meet upon the street could be treated in the exact same fashion as your wife. So you're totally unpredictable at that point. That person is unpredictable. And what that means is the utter destruction of humanity. So I think the educational path that we're on, and this is one of the reasons for this podcast, Paideia Today, is to seek for a recovery of a lost tradition of learning. So we are going over great books, many of them that we've covered thus far, Milton being the first writer in season 3. But the aim here is, I think, a recovery of a richness, not just of texts, but of appropriating them and making them a part of us, of digesting them and memorizing them, dare I say.
Yes, the books that we're looking at here constitute some of the most important memories we could possibly uh, carry around with us to inform our course in the future. A lot of people don't necessarily think of books as memory, or if they do think of books as memory, they think that it's this memory is autonomous, sitting on a bookshelf beside them or something like this. It's not something in their living mind as they consider the issue, consider the art of the present moment in which they find themselves. And so this is, of course, one of the things that any, I think, responsible literary instructor, professor, teacher is at pains to do, is to build up the memory of their students so that they can be making informed, rich, wise decisions for their future. It's not to say that reading literature is purely functional and pragmatic and instrumental in that sense. It has a dual purpose, but we're not going to get into that. Nevertheless, modern education unashamedly, openly, loudly ridicules memorization. They seldom provide reasons for why why they're ridiculing memorization as a
Oh,
pedagogical, that is to say, educational undertaking. They simply give you the horse laugh. They pretend that it's risible, and when you respond with your side of the argument, the response is usually silence. But there's no doubt education has completely ditched in the mainstream memorization as a learning and educational tool.
yeah, the shift is in uh, John Dewey's progressivism. It's exactly, we're educating for the future by learning things that will be revealed in the future, as opposed to holding on to the things of the past, which is the aim of education according to Milton's treatise on education. It's to restore the ruins of our first parents.
Yes.
So it's to restore and to recover and to hold on to what was lost. And in that recovery, we recover also our humanity to some degree. And so when we read words on the page, the words themselves are appropriating us. It's not just that we are appropriating that, something of us is being
Yes.
also appropriated. So there's a really good book, and we mentioned this last time or a few times ago, and I don't know if you read this one, Bill. by Jacques Ellul, The Humiliation of the Word. And this is really an interesting book
No,
because,
read other
yeah,
stuff about that.
so he argues that we've moved in the visual age away from the verbal means of understanding and have effectively displaced it. So talk about Milton's iconoclasties, we have effectively become an idolatrous age. We're devoted to the image rather than the word, and our humanity is being crushed in the process. Discourse, debate, communication, and to some degree, our very personhood is at stake in it.
Yeah, it's a planet now no longer of speech and discourse. It's a planet of noise, which is a very different thing, of course. And in that sense, it is a silent planet that we move towards at this juncture. And I think this is also one of the great reasons for reading and thinking deeply about texts like, especially Paradise Lost, which I think is very, very key to this, which is that I see one of the central crises of our present age as being anthropological in nature. Our sense of individual human value is enormously under threat right now, and we need to find ways of speaking back into that, which are both grounded in the best that has been written, thought, and said on the one hand, and yet which is relevant to the immediate moment in which we find ourselves. I use that dangerous word, relevant there, but nevertheless, I think this is an endeavor that some modern intellectuals are engaged upon, but I think this endeavor needs a lot more saliency right now amongst like-minded individuals.
Yeah.
Dr. Masson, have we just set up sufficiently the context for Paradise Lost itself?
I think so, because I mean, we could do a whole course on Milton, and obviously I've made a strong appeal that we could spend the whole season 3 on Milton, but that's not the purpose of this podcast. That I can do in a different context, and I do in different contexts, and it should be done. But for Paradise Lost, I think it does set it up sufficiently for us to be able to go into it next week. And I think we maybe should do that next week. Let's move on to Paradise Lost next week, talk about its beginnings and the fantastic invocation in the first 26 lines, and all of the material that he's drawing upon there. And yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
Excellent. Good.
Okay. Well, without further ado, I am Scott Masson again with Paideia Today. My colleague Bill Friesen here. Look forward to seeing you all next time. Bye for now.